You see, true leadership isn't about who makes the most noise, who dominates the headlines, or who's trending on social media. It's not about who cracks the most outrageous joke or who can provoke the loudest reaction. No, leadership is about vision, quiet, steady, and unshakable. It's about speaking with a purpose, not just with volume. That's the difference between a man who plays to the crowd and a man who speaks to change the course of history. One is there for the moment. The other is there to move the moment forward. When Donald Trump made his joke, dismissive off the cuff, and meant to draw laughter or maybe stir controversy, the world paused for a reaction. That's what jokes like that are designed for, to create noise, to distract, to provoke. But the African president, standing tall and rooted in the dignity of his people, didn't flinch. He didn't fire back with another jab. He didn't try to one-up the insult. Instead, he chose the higher road, the road of substance, the road of vision. And in that moment, he made history, not because he shouted louder, but because he spoke clearer. True leaders understand that every word they speak is a seed, and depending on how they speak, that seed either withers or it grows. Trump's words, though loud and attention-grabbing, were hollow. They didn't plant anything lasting. Not progress, not unity, not understanding. But the African president's response, that was a seed of pride, of courage, of legacy. He reminded the world that the continent he represents is not to be laughed at, not to be diminished, and not to be ignored. He didn't have to raise his voice. The weight of his truth did the heavy lifting. It's in these moments where you see the contrast. One man reaches for applause, the other reaches for impact. And the thing is, real impact doesn't always look flashy. It looks like calm. It looks like measured strength. It looks like standing in front of a microphone and speaking not just for yourself, but for generations who've been silenced, mocked, and overlooked, and doing so with grace, with facts, and with power. That's not weakness, that's mastery, that's leadership. People often confuse volume with power, but the loudest man in the room is often the most unsure. A true leader doesn't need to yell because he knows his words already carry weight. He doesn't need to perform because the truth doesn't need a stage. It needs a spine. The African president didn't try to match ego with ego. He stood firm in his message, in his identity, and in his responsibility to represent something bigger than himself. That's what real leadership looks like. And while some may remember the joke, history will remember the response. Not because it was dramatic, not because it made headlines, but because it echoed the kind of strength that doesn't fade with time. It echoed clarity, integrity, vision. And in the long run, those are the qualities that build nations, that shift narratives, and that inspire generations to come. In the end, it's not how loud you speak, it's why you speak. There's a difference between commanding respect and simply taking up space. A real leader doesn't need to shout to be heard. He doesn't need to intimidate or distract or dazzle with ego. Because respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn. You earn it through service, through vision, and through consistency. That's the kind of respect the African president earned when he stepped up, not just as a head of state, but as a voice of integrity in a world that too often rewards noise over substance. Now contrast that with someone like Donald Trump, a man who, whether on the campaign trail or behind a podium, often turns leadership into performance. There's no denying he knows how to work a crowd. But performing isn't leading. Telling a joke at the expense of others doesn't show strength. It reveals insecurity, because a man confident in his leadership doesn't belittle others to make himself feel bigger. He builds bridges, not punchlines. And the world sees that. The world listens. Maybe not right away, but over time, people learn to recognize the difference. They learn that the person who talks the most isn't always the one worth listening to. Because when a true leader speaks, there's weight behind his words. There's history. There's experience. There's a sense that he's not just trying to impress you. He's trying to uplift you. And that's exactly what the African president did. He didn't try to defend himself with fire. He didn't stoop to the level of banter or showmanship. He showed something far rarer in leadership: restraint, dignity, composure. And through that, he shifted the entire conversation from mockery to meaning. While the world expected another round of spectacle, he gave them substance. And in doing so, he reminded us what leadership is supposed to look like. That's the difference between ego and respect. Ego fills the room. It makes it about the individual, about the applause, about the moment. But respect commands the room. It changes the atmosphere. It makes people sit up and listen, not because they're entertained, but because they're moved. That's not easy. That takes patience. It takes courage. It takes a long-term mindset in a short-term world. And that brings us to something even deeper. Because what the African president did wasn't just a reaction. It was a declaration. A declaration that dignity doesn't have to shout to be heard. That the value of a people, of a continent, of a culture, cannot be defined by someone else's joke. His response wasn't just about himself. It was about all the young people watching, wondering how to carry themselves in a world that doesn't always take them seriously. He taught them that you don't fight fire with fire. You fight it with purpose, with strength rooted in calm. In this world, it's easy to get caught up in the noise, to mistake visibility for value. But what lasts, what truly endures, is respect. And that's not handed out freely. It's earned by those who know that leadership is not about being liked. It's about being trusted. It's about having a voice that rises above the chaos, not because it's loud, but because it's true. And when it's all said and done, people may forget the joke, but they'll never forget the man who refused to laugh at it and instead chose to lead. Legacy isn't written in hashtags or headlines. It's not carved out of applause or fueled by crowd reactions. Legacy is built slowly, sometimes quietly, in the background of big moments. It's formed through decisions made when the cameras aren't rolling, through the courage to speak truth when it's uncomfortable, and through the strength to act when others only talk. That's the difference between a punchline and a principle. One fades in minutes, the other shapes the course of history. When Donald Trump cracked that joke, it was just another moment in a long line of moments where ego took center stage. A quick laugh, maybe a few cheers from a friendly crowd, but nothing lasting, nothing meaningful. Jokes like that aren't meant to build, they're meant to stir. But what happens after the laughter dies down? What's left when the echo of applause fades? That's when you find out who's really leading. That's when you see who's standing on solid ground and who's dancing in the spotlight. Now, the African president in question, he didn't try to match sarcasm with sarcasm. He didn't come back with a clever line to steal the moment. No, he stood up, and with calm authority, he turned that moment into something far bigger, something that carried weight, something that would be remembered, not for entertainment, but for courage. He made history because he didn't reduce himself to the level of the mockery. He rose above it. And when he did, he elevated everyone he represented. That's what leadership looks. It's not about what you say to win the moment. It's about what you stand for when the moment challenges you. Real leaders don't worry about trending. They worry about truth. They don't perform for the crowd. They speak for the people. Because they know that long after the lights go out and the audience moves on, it's their actions that will remain. And those actions over time become legacy. This African leader, with his composure and his conviction, reminded the world of that truth. He reminded us that leadership isn't built with noise. It's built with vision. And when you have vision, you don't need a microphone to be heard. The power of his words wasn't in how loud he said them, but in how true they rang. In a single response, he shifted the conversation. He placed dignity where there was disrespect. He traded showmanship for statesmanship. And history will remember him not as a man who clapped back, but as a man who stood tall. Because here's the thing, jokes are fleeting, they come and go like gusts of wind. But character, that lasts. Vision, that echoes. And the words of a true leader, words spoken with clarity, with courage, with conviction, those words don't just sit in the air. They land in people's hearts, they change minds, they push nations forward. So yes, one man made a joke, he got his laugh. He got his moment, but another man made history. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to retaliate. He just needed to speak truth, and the world listened. That's how true leaders speak. Power doesn't always look the way we expect it to. It doesn't have to come wrapped in charisma, force, or a booming voice. Real power often moves quietly with purpose. It doesn't rush to please the crowd or chase approval. Instead, it stands firm, rooted in values and clarity. That's the kind of leadership that lasts. That's the kind of power the African president displayed. While Trump played for laughs, for reactions, for the quick hit of approval, this leader spoke not for applause, but for impact. And in doing so, He reminded us of a truth too many forget. True power is serving people, not pleasing crowds. When you lead from the stage, everything becomes a performance. Every word is crafted for effect, every gesture exaggerated for attention. But when you lead from purpose, the focus shifts. It becomes less about how you look and more about who you represent. The African president didn't step to the microphone to impress anyone. He wasn't there to charm the media or steal the spotlight. He was there to speak for his country, for his continent, and for those whose voices are too often ignored. That's a different kind of strength. It's not loud, but it's unshakable. And make no mistake, there's a cost to that kind of leadership. When you stop chasing approval, you open yourself to criticism. When you refuse to be a puppet for applause, some may call you cold or too serious or even weak. But that's because we've been conditioned to equate power with performance. We think if a leader doesn't entertain us, they're failing us. That couldn't be further from the truth. Entertainment is momentary, service is lasting. And service, genuine, selfless service, is where true leadership begins. Trump, in that moment, wasn't serving anyone, not even himself. He was feeding ego. And while ego might satisfy for a second, it builds nothing. It inspires no one. It leaves no legacy behind. The African president, on the other hand, chose a different path. He didn't match mockery with mockery. He didn't pander to the room. He understood that every word he spoke was an opportunity to build something bigger than himself, to show young people back home and around the world what leadership rooted in service looks like. That's the kind of leadership that doesn't fade with news cycles. That's the kind of leadership that reshapes how people see themselves. And it's quiet, steady choices like that which end up changing nations. Not the loud declarations or flashy moments, but the consistent refusal to lower your standards for the sake of being liked. That's what makes a leader real. Not just in title, but in legacy. When you serve people, you carry the weight of their hope, their struggle, their dreams. You don't take that lightly. You don't turn that into a joke. You carry it with humility and with focus. The African president understood that. He didn't let the moment drag him into pettiness. He rose above it, and in doing so, carried everyone watching a little higher, too. So while one man performed, the other led. One chased applause, the other earned respect. And respect, true, deep, lasting respect, doesn't come from pleasing a crowd. It comes from showing up for the people you're called to serve, every time, without compromise. That is leadership. Dignity doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't flinch when challenged or fold when tested. Dignity is its own kind of power. The quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. And in moments where others might lash out, crack back, or try to prove their worth, dignity simply stands. And that's exactly what the African president did. When faced with a shallow joke, when presented with a public slight, he didn't respond with outrage or sarcasm. He responded with composure, with clarity, with truth. Because when you know your worth, you don't need to argue it. That moment could have gone differently. It could have spiraled into pettiness, one insult met with another, one leader trying to outdo the other with wit or arrogance. But instead, the African president stood tall. He stood in the truth of who he is and what he represents, and that did all the speaking for him. And in that silence, in that restraint, the world saw the contrast. One man reaching for a laugh, another man holding the weight of his people with poise. That is the strength of dignity. It answers without reacting. It speaks without shouting. Some may have expected him to clap back, to trade fire for fire, but he chose a higher road, not because he was weak, but because he was wise. Because he understood that leadership isn't measured in how loud you talk when disrespected, but in how you carry yourself when the world is watching. And the world was watching. In that split second, it wasn't just a response between two men. It was a reflection of what leadership looks like in two very different forms. Trump, as always, was working the crowd. That's his lane. Entertain, provoke, distract. But leadership isn't a performance. And history doesn't record how many people laughed at your jokes. It remembers who stood for something, who elevated the moment, who refused to descend into chaos when they had every reason to. That's what the African president gave us, a moment of clarity, a moment where class outshined ego, where character outweighed charisma, And here's what makes that kind of leadership so powerful. It's not just about what you say. It's about what you teach by how you respond. Young people watching saw a leader who didn't need to belittle someone else to assert himself. They saw a man who could have reacted in anger but chose grace instead. That leaves a mark. That sets an example. That says, you don't have to shout to be heard. You just have to stand in your truth. Dignity isn't passive. It's disciplined. It's knowing that silence isn't weakness when it comes from strength. It's knowing when to speak and how to speak so that your words carry weight, not just volume. And the African president's words, measured and clear, carried more power than 1,000 jokes. Because they were rooted in something deeper than ego. They were rooted in identity, in purpose, in the unshakable pride of someone who knows who he is. So while others scrambled for applause or headlines, he made a different kind of noise. The kind that lingers in the hearts of those who know what real leadership looks like. The kind that reminds us that you don't have to defend your dignity when you live it every day. You just have to show up, speak truth, and walk with grace. And in doing so, he reminded the world that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's simply standing firm while the rest of the room tries to figure out why they feel small. History doesn't remember noise, it remembers meaning. It doesn't celebrate the loudest person in the room. It celebrates the one who had the courage to stand alone, to speak truth, and to lead with integrity. That's why, years from now, people may forget the joke Donald Trump made. It may be buried under 1,000 other sound bites, forgotten like a passing headline, but the world won't forget the African president who chose a different path in that moment. He didn't try to match insult with insult. He didn't play into the performance. He stood his ground, and in doing so, he made a mark that will outlive the laughter. Because that's what true leadership is about. It's not about reacting, it's about responding. It's not about entertaining the crowd. It's about elevating the conversation. The African president showed the world that leadership isn't just about holding power. It's about holding a standard. And when that standard is rooted in self-respect, cultural pride, and a deep responsibility to your people, you don't need theatrics. You just need clarity. Trump's joke was quick, maybe even strategic. A moment of levity to stir his audience, to control the energy in the room. But that's the problem with those kinds of moments. They're designed to evaporate. They're made to stir emotion, not reflection. And when the emotion passes, there's nothing left to build on. That's the difference between a man chasing applause and one chasing purpose. One wants to be remembered today. The other wants to be remembered forever. And that African president, he chose forever. With restraint, with dignity, and with vision, he gave the world a model of how a true leader speaks, not to provoke, but to inspire. His words weren't for that room alone. They were for every young African child watching, for every community tired of being reduced to stereotypes, for every person who's ever felt the sting of being underestimated. In that moment, he wasn't just defending his nation, he was lifting it, quietly, powerfully, permanently. You see, leadership is about more than position. It's about posture. It's about the way you stand when you're tested. And when he was tested, he didn't flinch. He didn't fall into the trap of trying to prove himself with anger or noise. He simply showed the world who he already was. That is the kind of moment history clings to, not the kind that ends in a punchline, but the kind that begins a movement. The truth is, we live in a world that often confuses performance with power, but history, real history, always separates the two. It doesn't care who entertained the crowd. It cares who elevated the people, and the people will remember the one who spoke not to be heard, but to be understood, not to be liked, but to be believed. So while some will remember the man who made the joke, history will honor the one who made a statement. A statement not shouted, not dramatized, but spoken with the weight of generations behind it. A statement that reminded us all that real strength doesn't come from being louder. It comes from being wiser. Because when the cameras turn off and the microphones are put away, it's not the laugh that lingers, it's the legacy.